Hi, in this video I would like to share with you some ideas for some fun things I like to do on the Octatrack with percussion tracks and rhythmic things using the LFOs. To illustrate, I've got this little thing going here. Which I quite like, but the hi-hat track I think is a bit boring. It's just this one sample placed on step 1 here, and then it repeats after one bar. Now I could, to make this more interesting, punch in a different sequence and use the steps right here. But what I also like to do is just using the LFOs on the Octatrack, which I think are really great. So I'm going to do this here. I'm going to the LFO page, pressing this LFO button twice to get into the LFO Setup menu. And then I'm going to change this to T1, which is a custom LFO shape. And I can design my own LFO shape by going down to this design menu. I can press and hold any of these 16 steps, for example, step 5, and then increase this or decrease it. I'm going to set this to 120. And I'm going to do the same thing for step 13. This way, I have an LFO which does kind of backbeats or offbeats. By the way, you can also adjust these simultaneously if you hold the two buttons at the same time and then turn this level dial. You're adjusting both of them. And then I'm going back to the LFO1 setup page. Oh, it seems to be on track 2 here. The LFO shape I just drew. I'm going to increase the depth. And then what I'm also going to do is I'm going to change the trig mode from free to sync, maybe sync 1. And then I'm going to set the speed to 64 because all the powers of 2 are going to lead to some reasonable rhythmic values synced to the tempo. Now, as you can hear, this step right here pitches it up. But if I want these to be backbeats, I have to make the LFO faster, and I can do this by multiplying this times 2. If I wanted offbeat, I could multiply it one more time. Now the LFO only has an effect during the first half of the bar. This is because the trig mode is set to sync 1. If I set it to sync trig, I think it should re-trigger after it has finished one cycle. Luckily, I can use this LFO I just drew multiple times with different tempos. So I could, for example, go to LFO 2 and select the same wave shape here, T2, and multiply it by 2 this time. Again, I'm setting the speed to 64 and increasing the depth. And maybe I'm going to set this to something different. Sometimes just volume has a nice effect. Oh, I forgot to adjust the trig mode. I'm going to set this to sync 1. By the way, if you want to, you can also adjust the shape of these steps. You do this by holding the steps you want to change and then pressing the tap tempo button. Now these yellow lights tell us that these steps have a ramp down shape going instead of a square. Now, instead of the very simple even hi-hats, we have a more interesting beat going on. Maybe to compare this, I can dial back the depths of these LFOs. This brings in the backbeat, and this brings in the offbeat. Now there's a third LFO available. I'm going to use this one too. Maybe I'm going to draw another one of these LFO shapes. There are 8 available, 1 for each track, but you can use them all on the same track. But to get to a different wave shape, for example, I have to press T1 and then I get a blank one and I can make a new LFO shape. I can also go negative if I want to. I'm going to do this here. And then I'm just going to see what happens if I assign this to, well, any old value, I guess. Maybe filter width? Why not? Maybe I will have to decrease the filter frequency first for this to have an effect, but we'll see in just a second. I'm going to set this to, yeah, either one of those to sync trick or sync 1. The multiplier will set to ×2, and then I'll pick the T1 LFO shape. Now it does have an effect where the LFO goes negative, but it doesn't do anything where it goes positive because it's all the way open already. So if I dial this back, maybe I could also play around a little bit with these shape controls. So maybe for, which one is it? This one. For these two, I'm going to try the ramping shape. Let's hear what this sounds like with the kick. Like I said, you can also use these on multiple tracks. So for example, on track 3 here, I've got another percussion thing going. Which I could easily modulate with the same LFO shape I used for track 2. So I'm going to pick this one. Pitch might be a bit weird, but we'll just see what happens. If I dial this all the way up, it should go up and down by 1 octave. It's not having an effect. I'm in the wrong track. I pressed track 1 to adjust the LFO, the T1 LFO shape, and now I'm applying this modulation to track 1, which is the bass drum, which I do not want. So I'll just dial back to depth. I'll go back to track 3. I'll dial the depth all the way up. I'll set the speed to 64, the trig mode to sync trick, the wave I'm going to set to T1, so I get the same rhythm like I did on the filter modulation for the hi-hats, and then the multiplier I'm going to set to ×2, which in this case makes the LFO wave 1 bar long. Yeah, why not? It's kind of cool. Let's hear it with the hi-hats. Let's bring in the kick. Now, one thing I like to do here is assign the depths of the LFOs for the hi-hats here, for example, to a scene. So, for example, this scene 9 here, I'm gonna just move these slightly so I can assign them to the scene, and then I'm dialing them back to 0. What I could also do is the decrease in the filter cutoff, assign this also to the scene. So I can open the filter back up with the slider on the left with no scene applied. Filter's all open, and then by moving it to the right, filter decreases, but the LFO modulation opens it. On the steps, I decided to increase the value of. I could assign the modulation for track 3 as well, or I could also copy the scene and then paste it here. And then for this one, assign the modulation for the second percussion track as well. I'm dialing this back to 0. So here we have no modulation at all. And then I'm picking scene 9. This is only hi-hat modulation. And then scene 10. Oh, I have to turn this on. Scene 10. Both of them. Of course. Get all the values in between. This might sound funny at times because of the pitch mod, but there's some nice spots here. Maybe let's add some modulation with LFO 2 on this second track as well. Maybe I'm going to use a standard waveform here. I'm just going to pick a destination and then going to see what it sounds like. So for example, the filter bass. I want this to be in sync though, so I'll set it to 64 and multiply it by 4. Sync this. Try in different shapes. Faster speed. I'm muting the other tracks. Yeah, here it sounds more interesting. Yeah, let's talk about the sequencer as well, because if I enter multiple steps here, for example, all of them, which would result in us only hearing the very beginning of the sample or just the first hi-hat. Let's have a listen to this. I'm moving the slider to the left here with no scenes applied. So now every hi-hat sounds the same. It's a bit tilted towards the left, but I guess I'm fine with that. Or I could, to make up for that, maybe move it slightly to the right. Yeah. What this allows me to do is use the envelopes for the amp and for the filter. So dial this back here and this as well. And this way I'm getting a short hi-hat sound. I've already used all 3 LFOs here, but just for demonstration purposes, let's maybe hear what this sounds like if I apply some modulation to this release parameter of the amp. Also kind of cool. Or I could use less steps, and then by using the release control, get like accents, and it sounds kind of like a delay now. Like I said, the filter envelope is at our disposal as well. Could use probability for these guys. And this way, with the filter all the way open and hold and release all the way open, it should still sound the same. Or almost the same, because we're not getting the exact same hi-hat sound, which is actually kind of nice. Of course, this is not by any means restricted to percussive things. I could also maybe the bass track. Let's turn this on. Modulate this with an LFO to get some movement in there, which is super easy to do. So I'm going to track 4 for this. And here I'm just going to pick a ramp down shape, set this to 64 and sync it. Increase the depth and the multiplier. And set this maybe to the filter width. And decrease the cutoff frequency. So I get some nice movements in this bass line. Or again, for the chord track I've got here, maybe it'd be nice to use one of the custom LFOs here as well. So I'm going to track 6 to the LFO menu, and then again picking this T1 LFO. I'll sync this, set the speed to 64, increase the depth. I'm going with the filter as well here. So I'm gonna add the modulation of the bass and of the chord track also to a scene. So this is where we started. And this is where we are right now. Only the beat. This is where I started. And this is with the LFO stuff. Depending on what the track calls for, I think both are nice. And it's definitely cool to be able to fade back and forth. So yeah, no need to make this any longer than it needs to be. I hope you found this interesting or maybe helpful, or maybe you found a thing or two in here that you're eager to try yourself. I'm just gonna play around a little bit longer with this and would like to thank you a lot for watching.